The morning started like any other Tuesday at Fort Braxton. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos woke up at 5:30, just like she had for the past 8 years. She put on her uniform with the same pride she felt the day she first earned her stripes. The mirror reflected back a woman who had given everything to serve her country. 3 combat deployments, countless nights away from family, and a perfect service record that made her superiors proud. Maria grabbed her coffee and headed to the communications center where she worked. The base was already buzzing with activity. Soldiers jogged past in formation, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect rhythm. The flag snapped in the morning breeze, and everything felt normal. Everything felt right, but something was different. Today, as she walked toward her building, Maria noticed people looking at her strangely. Fellow soldiers she had worked with for years suddenly avoided eye contact. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who usually greeted her with a smile and a joke about the weather, quickly turned and walked the other way when he saw her coming. Maria shrugged it off. Maybe everyone was just having a rough morning. She swiped her security card at the entrance to the communications building. The light flashed red. She tried again, red again. That was odd. Her clearance had never been an issue before. She walked to the front desk where Corporal Johnson was stationed. "Hey, Johnson, my card seems to be acting up. Can you buzz me in?" Johnson looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair and wouldn't meet her eyes. "Sorry, Sergeant Santos, I have orders not to let you into the building." Maria felt her stomach drop. "Orders? What orders? From who?" "I can't say, Sergeant. I'm sorry." Johnson's voice was barely above a whisper. Before Maria could ask another question, she heard heavy footsteps behind her. She turned to see 2 military police officers walking toward her. Their faces were stone cold, showing no emotion at all. Behind them walked Colonel Patterson, the base commander. Maria had only spoken to him a few times, but he had always been respectful and professional. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Colonel Patterson said, his voice flat and official. "You need to come with me immediately." Maria's heart started racing. "Sir." "What's going on? Have I done something wrong?" "Just follow me, Sergeant." The walk to the administrative building felt like it took forever. Other soldiers stopped what they were doing to watch. Maria could feel their eyes on her, but she couldn't understand why. Yesterday she had been just another soldier doing her job. Today she felt like a criminal being marched to trial. They entered a small, windowless office. Colonel Patterson sat behind a metal desk while the 2 MPs stood by the door like guards. Maria remained standing, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. The silence stretched on until it became almost unbearable. Finally, Colonel Patterson opened a folder and pulled out some papers. "Staff Sergeant Santos, you're being discharged from the United States Army, effective immediately." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. "Discharged? Sir, I don't understand. What are the charges? What did I do wrong?" "This is an administrative discharge. No charges are being filed." "But sir, my record is clean." "I've never been written up for anything. I've served with honor for 8 years. There has to be some mistake." Colonel Patterson's expression didn't change. "The decision has been made at the highest levels. Your security clearance is revoked and you are to leave this base within the hour." Maria felt like the room was spinning. "Sir, please, I need to understand. What happened? What did I do? I have a right to know." "You have no rights in this matter, Santos. This is a matter of national security." "National security?" Maria's voice cracked. "Sir, I've dedicated my life to protecting this country. I've been deployed 3 times. I've never done anything to compromise security." One of the MPs stepped forward and handed her a plastic bag. Inside were her personal belongings from her locker. Her photos, her letters from home, a small American flag her nephew had given her. Everything that made that locker hers was now stuffed into a clear bag like evidence from a crime scene. "Your quarters have been cleared as well," the MP said. "These are your personal items." Maria stared at the bag in disbelief. "You went through my room? Who gave you permission to do that?" No one answered. Colonel Patterson stood up and walked around the desk. "Sergeant Santos, you are no longer authorized to be on this base. The MPs will escort you to the gate." Sir, I need my car, my wallet, my civilian clothes. Your vehicle will be delivered to the gate. Your wallet and phone are in the bag. As for clothes, you'll have to make do with what you have. Maria looked down at her uniform. The same uniform she had worn with pride for 8 years. Now it felt like a costume she was no longer allowed to wear. Sir, can I at least change out of my uniform? Negative? Time is of the essence. The walk to the base entrance was the longest of Maria's life. Soldiers she had served with, trained with, and considered friends all turned away as she passed. Some looked sad, others looked confused, but none of them spoke to her. It was like she had become invisible, or worse, like she had become the enemy. At the gate, her car was waiting. The keys were on the hood along with her wallet and phone. The gate guard, a young private she had seen every day for 2 years, wouldn't even look at her as he took her military ID card. I need that back, she said, reaching for it. No, ma'am. Orders are to confiscate all military identification. Maria watched as he dropped her ID into a box with other discarded cards. 8 years of service, reduced to a piece of plastic in a cardboard box. She got into her car with shaking hands. As she started the engine, she looked back at the base one more time. Fort Braxton had been her home, her life, her world. Now it was forbidden territory. She drove through the gate for the last time, watching it close behind her in her rearview mirror. The road ahead was empty and uncertain. Maria had no idea where to go or what to do next. She had no civilian job lined up, no apartment to go to, no plan for life outside the military. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in, was gone in the span of 1 hour. As she drove away from the only life she had known, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, but what? She ran through the last few weeks in her mind, trying to think of anything she might have done wrong. Nothing came to mind. She had followed every order, completed every mission, maintained every standard. The only thing that seemed even slightly unusual was 3 weeks ago. When she had been working late in the communications center, she had been updating security protocols when she noticed some strange message traffic. It didn't seem like normal military communications, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Could that be connected to what happened today? Maria drove into an uncertain future, not knowing that her discovery 3 weeks ago had put her in the crosshairs of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. She also didn't know that somewhere people were watching her every move, making sure she stayed quiet about what she had seen. All she knew was that her life as she knew it was over, and she had no idea why. 6 months had passed since that terrible day at Fort Braxton, and Maria's life had become something she never could have imagined. The woman who once commanded respect on a military base now lived in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat. The constant smell of detergent and fabric softener had become the backdrop of her new reality. Every morning, Maria woke up to the sound of washing machines spinning below her floor. The thin walls meant she could hear everything: conversations in languages she didn't understand, children crying, and the endless cycle of people coming and going. It was so different from the structured, predictable routine of base life that sometimes she felt like she was living in a different world entirely. The apartment was barely 300 square feet. Her bed was a fold-out couch that she sat up each night and put away each morning. A small table served as both her dining room and her desk. The kitchenette had a hot plate, a mini fridge, and exactly enough space for one person to stand. It was all she could afford, and even then, she was behind on rent. Maria had applied for veteran benefits the day after her discharge, expecting the process to be smooth. After all, she had 8 years of honorable service and a spotless record. But week after week she received the same response: "Your application is being reviewed. Please allow additional processing time." When she called the VA office, she was transferred from person to person, each one telling her something different. Some said her paperwork was incomplete. Others said they had no record of her service at all. "That's impossible," Maria had told the woman on the phone during her most recent call. "I served for 8 years. I have my discharge papers right here." "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but our system shows no record of your military service." You'll need to provide additional documentation. What kind of documentation? I've already sent everything you asked for 3 times. I'm sorry, but that's all I can tell you. You'll need to speak with your congressman if you want to appeal this decision. Maria had tried calling her congressman's office, but they told her the same thing. They needed to verify her service record, and that verification was taking longer than usual. Everything about her military life seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The job search had been even more frustrating. Maria had skills that should have made her valuable in the civilian world. She had managed communication systems, supervised teams of soldiers, and handled classified information with the highest level of security clearance. But every interview seemed to go the same way. At first, employers seemed interested. Her resume looked impressive on paper, but then something would happen. The hiring manager would step out to make a phone call and come back with a completely different attitude. Or they would tell her they needed to run a background check and then never call back. One manager had been honest enough to tell her that there were concerns about her employment history, but wouldn't say what those concerns were. The only job she could find was at Rosie's Diner, a 24-hour restaurant near the highway. The owner, an older woman named Betty, who had run the place for 30 years, hired Maria without asking too many questions. The pay was minimum wage and the tips weren't much better, but it was honest work, and Betty treated her employees fairly. Maria worked double shifts whenever she could, pulling 12-hour days that left her exhausted. She served coffee to truck drivers at 3 in the morning, cleaned tables until her back ached, and smiled at customers even when they were rude. The hardest part wasn't the physical work. It was the way some people looked at her when they found out she was a veteran. What did you do over there? One customer had asked when he noticed her military bearing. I worked in communications, Maria had replied. Communications, huh? That's not real combat. My cousin was infantry. He saw real action. Maria had wanted to tell him about the mortar attacks she had survived, the friends she had lost, the nights she had stayed awake monitoring emergency channels while others slept safely. But she had learned to keep those stories to herself. Civilians didn't always understand, and she didn't have the energy to explain. The worst part of her new life wasn't the financial struggle or the job rejections. It was the feeling that she was being watched. It started small, a car that seemed to follow her home from work once or twice. Phone calls in the middle of the night where no one spoke, just silence on the other end before the line went dead. Mail that arrived open, with official-looking tape sealing it back together. At first, Maria thought she was being paranoid. The stress of her situation was making her imagine things. But the incidents kept happening, and they were too specific to be coincidence. The same dark sedan would be parked across from the diner when she started her shift and would disappear before she finished work. Her phone would ring at exactly 2:30 in the morning, 3 nights in a row. Letters from the VA and potential employers would arrive with broken seals and smudged ink. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Maria noticed the dark sedan again. This time, instead of walking home her usual route, she decided to test her suspicions. She turned left instead of right at the corner, walked an extra block, and doubled back through an alley. The sedan followed her every turn, staying exactly the same distance behind. Maria's heart started racing. She ducked into a convenience store and pretended to shop while watching through the window. The sedan pulled into a parking spot across the street and waited. When she finally left the store 20 minutes later, the car was gone. But she had gotten a partial look at the license plate. That night, Maria started a notebook. She wrote down every strange incident, every unexplained phone call, every time she felt like she was being followed. The pattern became clear quickly. Someone was definitely watching her, and they weren't trying very hard to hide it. In fact, it seemed like they wanted her to know she was being watched. The realization was terrifying. What had she done to deserve this kind of attention? What did these people want from her? The only unusual thing she could remember from her time at Fort Braxton was that night 3 weeks before her discharge, when she had been working late in the communications center. She had been updating security protocols, routine work that she had done dozens of times before. But that night, while she was organizing message traffic, she had noticed something odd. There were communications coming through channels that weren't supposed to be active. The messages were coded, but they didn't follow standard military encryption patterns. They looked more like civilian communications, possibly commercial. At the time, Maria had assumed it was some kind of test or training exercise. Different departments sometimes used the communications center for simulations. She had logged the unusual traffic in her report as she was supposed to do, and thought nothing more of it. But now, sitting in her tiny apartment with a notebook full of evidence that someone was stalking her, Maria began to wonder if those messages had been more important than she realized. What if they weren't part of a training exercise? What if she had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see? The thought kept her awake at night. Maria found herself going over that evening again and again, trying to remember every detail. The messages had been coming in between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. during the shift when the communications center was usually quiet. The traffic had been heavy for that time of night, and it had been routed through channels that were normally reserved for emergency communications. Maria wished she had paid more attention at the time, but she had been focused on her assigned tasks. Now, she couldn't help but wonder if those messages held the key to understanding why her life had been turned upside down. As the weeks went by, the surveillance became more obvious. Her apartment was broken into while she was at work, but nothing was stolen. Her locker at the diner was searched, again with nothing taken. It was like someone was sending her a message, "We can get to you anywhere, anytime." But Maria had survived 3 combat deployments. She had been trained to handle pressure, to think under stress, and to never give up. If someone wanted to intimidate her into silence, they had picked the wrong person. She started carrying a small camera with her, documenting the surveillance. She made copies of her notebook and hid them in different places. Most importantly, she started reaching out to people who might be able to help her understand what was happening. She contacted a veterans advocacy group, hoping they might have experience with cases like hers. She also started researching journalists who specialized in military affairs, thinking that maybe someone in the media would be interested in her story. Maria didn't know it yet, but her careful documentation and her refusal to be intimidated were about to pay off in ways she never could have imagined. Maria's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. After months of feeling like she was fighting invisible enemies, help arrived in the form of a phone call from someone she had never met. "Is this Maria Santos?" The voice on the other end was professional but cautious. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is David Chun. I'm an investigative journalist with the Washington Herald. I understand you might have information about irregularities at Fort Braxton." Maria's heart started beating faster. She had contacted several journalists weeks ago, but none of them had responded. "How did you get my number?" "I have sources who keep an eye on certain situations. Can we meet somewhere public? I think you'll be interested in what I have to tell you." 2 days later, Maria sat across from David in a crowded coffee shop downtown. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that reminded her of intelligence officers she had worked within the military. He had already ordered coffee for both of them when she arrived. "I've been investigating defense contractors for the past 2 years, David said, keeping his voice low. "Specifically, companies that have contracts with bases like Fort Braxton. Your case came to my attention because of some patterns I've been tracking." "What kind of patterns?" David pulled out a thin folder and slid it across the table. "Have you heard of a company called Meridian Defense Solutions?" Maria shook her head. "Should I have?" "They've had contracts with Fort Braxton for the past 5 years. Officially, they provide logistics support, moving equipment, managing supply chains, that sort of thing. But I've been tracking some of their shipments, and they don't add up." Maria opened the folder. Inside were photographs of trucks, shipping manifests, and what looked like financial documents. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" 3 weeks before your discharge, Meridian had a shipment go missing. Military-grade weapons and equipment worth about $12 million. The shipment was supposed to go to a base in Afghanistan, but it never arrived. Instead, it seems to have been diverted somewhere else entirely. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. 3 weeks before my discharge? Exactly. The same time? Period when you were working late shifts in the communications center. The same time period when someone intercepted communications that they weren't supposed to see. David leaned forward. Maria, I think you accidentally discovered evidence of weapons trafficking. And I think the people involved in that trafficking had you removed from the base to keep you quiet? Maria stared at the documents in front of her. The pieces were starting to come together, but it was almost too big to believe. You're saying that someone at Fort Braxton was working with this company to steal weapons? Not just someone. Based on what I found, this operation involves people at the highest levels of base command, plus civilian contractors, plus at least one person at the Pentagon who was helping cover their tracks. David pulled out another set of papers. These are communications logs that I obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. They show unusual message traffic during the exact nights you were working late. The timing matches perfectly with when Meridian shipments were being diverted. Maria recognized the format of the logs immediately. They were the same type of reports she had been filing during her work in the communications center. This is what I saw that night. These weird messages that didn't follow normal military protocols. Exactly. You stumbled onto coded communications between the conspirators. They were coordinating the theft and sale of military weapons. When you logged those communications in your official report, it created a paper trail that could have exposed the entire operation. So they had me discharged to cover it up? Think about it. If they had charged you with a crime or given you a bad conduct discharge, there would have been an investigation. Questions would have been asked. But an administrative discharge with no explanation? That makes you disappear without creating any official record of why. Maria felt sick to her stomach. Everything made sense now. The mysterious discharge, the surveillance, the way her benefits had been delayed and her job applications rejected. They've been trying to make sure I can't tell anyone what I saw. Worse than that, I think they've been trying to discredit you. If you ever did try to come forward, who would believe a discharged soldier with no benefits, no job, and no way to prove her story? David showed her more documents. Financial records showing large payments to offshore accounts. Photographs of weapons crates being loaded onto civilian trucks instead of military transport. Email communications between Meridian executives and people whose names had been blacked out but whose email addresses ended with military domains. The problem is, I need more evidence to publish this story, David said. Everything I have is circumstantial. I need proof that directly connects the missing weapons to the people involved. What kind of proof? The original communications logs from that night, the ones you filed in your report. If I can get those, and if they show what I think they show, that would be enough to break the story wide open. Maria laughed bitterly. Those logs are in a classified military database. I can't exactly walk back onto Fort Braxton and ask for copies. Actually, you might not need to. David's expression became more serious. I have a contact inside the Pentagon. Someone who's been helping me investigate defense contractor fraud. She's been trying to get access to Fort Braxton's communications records for months, but she needed to know exactly what to look for and when. And now you can tell her? Now I can tell her exactly which dates, which channels, and which time. Periods to focus on. With that specific information, she should be able to retrieve the logs through official channels. Maria felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. But she also felt afraid. David, if these people are as powerful as you say they are, aren't we putting ourselves in danger by investigating them? We're already in danger. You've been under surveillance for months. I've had my phone tapped and my apartment searched. The difference is now we're fighting back. David gave her a secure phone number where she could reach him any time. He also gave her a small device that looked like a USB drive. This is encrypted. If something happens to me, everything I've collected about this case is on here. Hide it somewhere safe. Over the next 2 weeks, Maria and David worked together to build their case. David's Pentagon contact, who went by the code name Falcon, was able to access the communications logs from Fort Braxton. When they finally got to see the actual messages that Maria had logged that night, the evidence was even more damning than they had hoped. The messages contained specific details about weapon serial numbers, delivery locations, and payment arrangements. They mentioned Meridian Defense Solutions by name. Most importantly, they included communications from email addresses that belonged to Colonel Patterson, the same officer who had discharged Maria without explanation. "This is it," David said, when they met to review the evidence. "This proves that Colonel Patterson was directly involved in the weapons trafficking. It also proves that you were discharged because you had evidence that could expose him." But as they prepared to publish the story, something unexpected happened. Maria received a message on the secure phone David had given her. It wasn't from David. The message was short and cryptic. "They know you have the files. Trust no one. Help is coming." "Who could have sent this?" Maria asked when she showed David the message. "I don't know, but whoever it is has access to military-grade encryption. This isn't some random person. Do you think it's a warning?" "Maybe, or maybe it's someone on the inside who's been watching this whole situation unfold." David decided to accelerate their timeline. Instead of waiting another week to double-check their sources, he would publish the story in 3 days. They arranged to meet at his office that Tuesday morning to go over the final article before it went to print. As Maria prepared for that meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The message had said, "Help is coming, but help from whom? And why now, just as they were about to expose the truth?" She spent Monday night going through all the evidence one more time, making sure she understood every detail. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Millions of dollars in stolen weapons. Corruption that reached from base commanders all the way to Pentagon officials. And at the center of it all, a young soldier who had simply been doing her job. When she accidentally uncovered the whole operation. As Maria got ready for bed, she looked out her window one last time. The dark sedan was there again, parked in its usual spot across the street. But tonight, there was something different. There were 2 other cars parked nearby that she had never seen before. And in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of helicopter rotors. Something was definitely about to happen. Maria just hoped that when it did, she would be on the right side of whatever came next. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the city like a heavy blanket. Maria woke up earlier than usual, her stomach tight with nervous energy. Today was the day David would publish the story that would expose the corruption at Fort Braxton. After months of living in fear and uncertainty, she was finally going to get answers. She dressed carefully, choosing her best pair of jeans and a clean sweater. It felt important to look presentable today, though she couldn't exactly say why. Maybe it was because after months of feeling powerless, she was finally taking control of her life again. The bus ride to David's office took 45 minutes through morning traffic. Maria spent the time looking out the window, watching the city wake up. Office workers hurried down sidewalks with coffee cups in their hands. Parents walked children to school bus stops. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful. It was hard to believe that in a few hours, their story would reveal a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the military. David's office was in an older building downtown, the kind with high ceilings and creaky wooden floors that spoke of a time when newspapers were the primary source of news. The Washington Herald occupied 3 floors, and Maria could hear the constant hum of activity as reporters worked on their stories. "You're early," David said when she arrived at his desk. He looked like he hadn't slept much, with dark circles under his eyes and an empty coffee cup that had clearly been refilled several times. "I couldn't sleep," Maria admitted. "Too nervous, I guess." "That's understandable. What we're about to publish is going to shake up a lot of powerful people." David's desk was covered with papers, photographs, and printed emails. Everything they had collected over the past few weeks was laid out in careful order, ready to support every claim in their article. Maria recognized many of the documents. The shipping manifest, the communications logs, the financial records that proved millions of dollars had been stolen. I've been here since 5 this morning, going through everything one more time, David said. I want to make absolutely sure we haven't missed anything. Once this story goes live, there's no taking it back. Maria picked up a copy of the article David had written. The headline read, Military Weapons Trafficking Ring Exposed, How Defense Contractors and Base Commanders Stole Millions in Equipment. Seeing it in print made everything feel more real. It's a good story, she said after reading the first few paragraphs. You explain everything clearly without making it too complicated. I tried to write it so that anyone could understand what happened. The American people deserved to know how their tax dollars were being stolen and how military equipment ended up in the wrong hands. As they worked, Maria noticed David kept checking his phone and looking toward the window. Are you expecting someone? She asked. Not exactly, but I've had this feeling all morning that something's going to happen today. Call it reporter's instinct. They spent the next hour going through the article paragraph by paragraph, making sure every fact was correct and every quote was accurate. David had done an excellent job of presenting the evidence in a way that built a clear case against the conspirators. By the time they finished, Maria felt confident that no one would be able to dismiss their story as speculation or conspiracy. Theory. All right, David said, checking his watch. It's 10:30. I'm going to send this to my editor, and we should be able to publish by noon. But just as David reached for his computer, they heard something that made them both freeze. The sound of helicopter rotors growing louder by the second. In a city full of traffic noise and construction, helicopter sounds weren't unusual. But this was different. This was the deep, powerful sound of military aircraft. Maria recognized it immediately. That's a Blackhawk, she said, her heart starting to race. David looked at her in confusion. A what? A military helicopter? I know that sound. I heard it hundreds of times during my deployments. The sound grew louder until it seemed like the helicopter was directly overhead. Other people in the office had stopped working and were looking toward the windows. Some were pointing at the sky and talking excitedly. David, called a voice from across the newsroom, you need to see this. They hurried to the window and looked down at the parking lot behind the building. Maria couldn't believe what she was seeing. A military Blackhawk helicopter was landing in the small parking area, its rotors whipping up dust and loose papers. Cars in the lot rocked back and forth from the powerful downdraft. This can't be happening, David said, his voice barely audible over the noise of the aircraft, but it was happening. As the helicopter touched down, its engines began to power down and the rotors started to slow. Through the windows of the aircraft, Maria could see figures moving inside. Someone was getting ready to exit. The first person to step out of the helicopter was a military police officer in full uniform. Then came another MP, followed by several people in civilian suits who looked like federal agents. But it was the fourth person to emerge that made Maria's knees go weak. Oh my God, she whispered. That's General Hayes. General Patricia Hayes was one of the most recognizable faces in the Pentagon. Maria had seen her on television dozens of times, usually speaking about military readiness or defense policy. She was known throughout the military as someone who didn't tolerate corruption or misconduct. If General Hayes was here, it meant this situation had reached the very top of the military command structure. The general? David asked. Are you sure? I'm positive. That's the Pentagon's Inspector General. She's the one who investigates corruption in the military. More people were emerging from the helicopter now. Maria counted at least 8 individuals. A mix of military personnel and civilians. They moved with the kind of purpose that suggested this wasn't a routine visit. This was a major operation. David, Maria said, her voice shaking with emotion, I think that message was right. Help really is coming. As they watched from the window, the group from the helicopter began moving toward the building. General Hayes led the way, flanked by the MPs and followed by the people in suits. They walked with the confidence of people who had the full authority. of the United States government behind them, David grabbed his camera and started taking pictures. "This is incredible. Do you realize what this means?" Maria was starting to understand. "It means our investigation wasn't the only one happening. It means someone with real power has been watching the situation." Within minutes, they could hear voices in the hallway outside David's office. Heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floors, and there was the sound of people talking in the urgent, clipped tones that Maria remembered from military briefings. Then there was a knock on the door to the newsroom. Not the casual knock of a visitor, but the firm, authoritative knock of someone who expected immediate attention. The editor of the Washington Herald, a woman named Janet Morrison, walked quickly toward the door. Everyone in the newsroom had stopped working and was watching the unfolding drama. Janet opened the door and stepped back in surprise. General Hayes entered the room, followed by her entourage. She was smaller in person than she appeared on television, but her presence filled the room immediately. Everything about her, from her perfect uniform to her confident bearing, spoke of someone who wielded enormous power. "I'm looking for David June and Maria Santos," General Hayes announced to the room. David stood up from his desk, and Maria felt her legs moving almost automatically. After months of hiding, of being afraid, of feeling like she had no allies, she found herself walking toward one of the most powerful people in the United States military. "I'm David Chun," David said, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "And I'm Maria Santos," Maria added, her military training taking over as she stood at attention. General Hayes looked at them both for a moment, her expression serious but not unfriendly. "Staff Sergeant Santos, you've been through quite an ordeal. Mr. Chun, your investigation has been very thorough." "Ma'am," Maria said, finding her voice, "I don't understand what's happening." "What's happening, Sergeant, is that justice is finally being served. We've been conducting our own investigation into the activities at Fort Braxton for the past 6 months. Your case was the key that helped us unlock everything." One of the civilians stepped forward and showed them a badge. "FBI, we've been working with the Inspector General's office to investigate defense contractor fraud. Your communications logs provided the final evidence we needed to make arrests." "Arrests?" David asked. "As we speak," General Hayes said, "federal agents are arresting Colonel Patterson, 3 executives from Meridian Defense Solutions, and 2 officials at the Pentagon who were involved in this conspiracy. The total value of the stolen equipment exceeds $15 million. Maria felt like she might faint. "Ma'am, does this mean—" "It means you were right, Sergeant Santos. Everything you observed, everything you reported, everything you suffered through, it was all connected to a massive criminal conspiracy. And because of your courage in coming forward, that conspiracy has been exposed." General Hayes gestured toward the helicopter visible through the window. "I came here personally because the United States military owes you an apology and much more than that. You were discharged illegally to cover up criminal activity." 3 months later, Maria stood on the steps of the Pentagon, wearing a dress uniform that fit her perfectly. The morning sun reflected off the polished brass buttons and the ribbons on her chest, including several new ones that had been added just that morning. It felt surreal to be back in uniform after almost a year of uncertainty and struggle. The Pentagon courtyard was filled with people. There were military officials from every branch of service, journalists with cameras and notepads, and family members who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. Maria's sister Rosa had flown in from California with her 2 children. Her parents had driven up from Texas, her father wearing his own military uniform from his service in Vietnam 30 years earlier. "I'm so proud of you, Mia," her mother had whispered when they embraced earlier that morning. "You never gave up even when everything seemed hopeless." Maria looked out at the crowd and spotted David Chun standing with the other journalists. He gave her a thumbs up and an encouraging smile. Their investigation had not only cleared her name but had led to one of the biggest military corruption scandals in recent history. David's articles had won several journalism awards, but he always made sure to credit Maria's courage in speaking out. General Hayes approached the podium, and the crowd fell silent. The same woman who had stepped out of the Blackhawk helicopter that day in David's office now stood ready to publicly restore Maria's honor and reputation. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes began, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "we are here today to recognize an extraordinary act of courage and integrity. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos represents the very best of what it means to serve in the United States military." Maria felt her eyes begin to water as General Hayes continued. 9 months ago, Sergeant Santos was wrongfully discharged from the Army. In an attempt to cover up criminal activity, she lost her career, her benefits, and her livelihood because she had the integrity to do her job honestly. Today we set the record straight. The general gestured for Maria to step forward. As she walked to the podium, Maria thought about everything that had led to this moment. The confused morning when she was escorted off Fort Braxton. The months of struggle and surveillance. The late nights working at the diner, wondering if she would ever understand what had happened to her. The fear and uncertainty that had consumed her life for almost a year. The investigation that followed Sergeant Santos's case revealed a conspiracy involving the theft of over $15 million in military equipment. General Hayes continued. Weapons that were meant to protect our soldiers overseas were instead diverted and sold for personal profit. This conspiracy involved military officers, defense contractors, and Pentagon officials who put greed above their duty to our country. Maria remembered the day the arrests were announced. She had watched the news coverage from her tiny apartment. Above the laundromat, barely able to believe that Colonel Patterson and the others were finally being held accountable. The man who had discharged her without explanation was now facing federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and treason. Sergeant Santos stumbled upon this conspiracy while performing her regular duties in the communications center at Fort Braxton. When she properly reported unusual communications traffic, as she had been trained to do, she unknowingly provided evidence that would later expose the entire criminal operation. General Hayes paused and looked directly at Maria. Instead of being commended for her diligence, Sergeant Santos was silenced through an illegal discharge. Her benefits were delayed, her employment prospects were sabotaged, and she was subjected to surveillance and intimidation. All of this happened because criminal conspirators within our own military sought to protect their illegal activities. The crowd murmured angrily at this revelation. Many of the military personnel in attendance looked genuinely shocked that such corruption had occurred within their ranks. Today, we not only restore Sergeant Santos to her rightful place in the United States Army, we also recognize her extraordinary service to our country. Her persistence in seeking the truth, despite facing overwhelming obstacles, led directly to the exposure of this conspiracy. General Hayes picked up a medal from the table beside the podium. Maria recognized it immediately as the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest honors the military could bestow. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, for your unwavering integrity, your courage in the face of adversity, and your dedication to the truth, I present you with the Distinguished Service Medal. As General Hayes placed the medal around Maria's neck, Maria felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that had been there for almost a year. The weight of doubt, of wondering if she had done something wrong, of feeling like she had failed somehow. All of that was gone now, replaced by a deep sense of validation and pride. The crowd erupted in applause. Maria looked out and saw her. Family cheering, David taking pictures for his follow-up story, and dozens of military personnel showing their respect and support. Some of the older veterans in the crowd had tears in their eyes. After the ceremony, there was a reception inside the Pentagon. Military officials came up to Maria throughout the afternoon to shake her hand and thank her for her service. Many of them shared their own stories about times when they had to make difficult decisions about speaking up against wrongdoing. "You?" "No," said Colonel Martinez, a woman who worked in the Inspector General's office. "Your case has already led to policy changes. We're implementing new protections for service members who report suspicious activities. Your experience is going to help protect other soldiers in the future." That evening, Maria sat with General Hayes in a quiet corner of the reception hall. The formal ceremony was over, and they could finally talk openly about everything that had happened. I have a proposition for you, Sergeant Santos, General Hayes said. Your experience over the past year has given you unique insights into how military corruption operates and how honest soldiers can be silenced. I'd like you to consider joining my team in the Inspector General's office. Maria was intrigued. What would that involve? You would help investigate cases of fraud and corruption throughout the military. You would also work on developing better systems to protect whistleblowers and ensure that what happened to you never happens to another soldier. It sounds important, Maria said, but I have to ask, would I be safe? The people who targeted me before, they might not be happy about me having that kind of position. General Hayes smiled. Sergeant Santos, you've already proven that you can't be intimidated or silenced. Besides, you wouldn't be working alone. You would have the full support of the Pentagon and the FBI, the days of criminals operating freely. Within our military are over. Maria thought about the offer. After everything she had been through, the idea of helping other soldiers avoid the same experience was appealing. She could make sure that honest service members were protected and that corruption was exposed quickly before it could spread. I accept, she said. When do I start? Next Monday, if you're ready. We already have several cases that could benefit from your perspective. As the reception wound down, Maria found herself outside on the Pentagon steps again, looking up at the American flag flying in the evening breeze. David joined her, carrying his camera and notebook. So what's next for you? He asked. I'm going to be working in the Inspector General's office, investigating corruption and protecting whistleblowers. That's perfect, David said. You'll be making sure other people don't have to go through what you went through. Exactly. David, I spent months feeling like my life had been destroyed for no reason. But now I realize that everything I went through led me to this moment. I'm going to be in a position to make real change, to protect honest soldiers and expose corruption. Maria looked back at the Pentagon, thinking about her new role and the responsibilities it would bring. I used to think that standing up for what's right would cost me everything. And it did for a while, but it also led me to something better than what I had before. The same Blackhawk helicopter that had landed in David's parking lot 3 months earlier was waiting nearby to transport Maria to her new assignment. As she walked toward it, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From that terrible morning when she was escorted off Fort Braxton to this moment of triumph and new purpose. Ready for your new mission, Sergeant Santos? General Hayes asked as they approached the helicopter. Maria smiled and gave a crisp salute. Ready, ma'am. As the helicopter lifted off into the evening sky, Maria looked down at the Pentagon growing smaller below them. She was no longer the confused and frightened woman who had been kicked off a military base without explanation. She was a decorated soldier with an important mission, flying toward a future where she could help ensure that truth and integrity would always prevail over corruption and cover-ups. The nightmare was over. The real work was just beginning.